Officers disrespected a young black girl in court, not knowing she was a White House insider. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" The officer's voice dripped with condescension, his smirk barely hiding the insult. Keisha Walker didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. The subtle jabs, the quiet humiliations, the way people like him assumed she didn't belong. But this time, they had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a young black woman in court standing up for her cousin. What they didn't see was the power she carried, the connections, the knowledge, the White House ID sitting quietly in her bag. And by the time the truth came out, the very people who mocked her would be begging for mercy. When Keisha Walker was 8 years old, she stood on the National Mall gazing up at the Washington Monument as the sun glinted off its marble peak. Her father, Kenneth, had taken her there on a breezy spring afternoon to show her that the very heart of America was not just a place for tourists and VIPs. It was a symbol of home for everyday folks with hopes and dreams. "One day," he told her, pressing a hand gently to her back, "you'll do something important here, Keisha, right here in this city." His voice carried not just love, but unshakable conviction. Growing up in Southeast D.C. wasn't always easy. There were days Keisha heard the wail of sirens more often than the sweet chirp of birds at sunrise. Some nights, she did her homework by the dim glow of the kitchen light, drifting in and out of her mother's gentle lullabies. As her peers ran the streets and got tangled in dangerous crowds, Keisha kept her focus. She found solace in the pages of books borrowed from the Earl Lloyd Jr. Memorial Library, where stories of trailblazers fed her imagination and sharpened her ambition. Her mother, Bethany, worked 2 jobs, a daytime receptionist at a local community center and an overnight cashier at a grocery store. Money was tight, but Keisha felt rich in the currency of unwavering support. She learned from her mother's determination that adversity could be not a wall, but a stepping stone, as long as one had the strength to stand tall. And stand tall Keisha did through scholarships, community initiatives, and eventually acceptance into Howard University. At Howard, Keisha discovered a passion for public policy and social justice, the perfect platform for her deep desire to right the wrongs she saw in her neighborhood. For years later, she graduated with honors, recognized by faculty and peers alike as a rising star who combined empathy with brilliance. After a brief internship at the Department of Education, Keisha was offered a position in the Office of Public Engagement at the White House. What might have seemed improbable to others felt like a natural progression for Keisha, a blossoming realization of her father's prophecy. She was, in fact, doing something important in this city. Though she never carried herself with arrogance or self-importance, she approached her duties coordinating youth outreach programs, connecting marginalized communities to federal resources with humility and an unquenchable desire to help. Nobody suspected that this unassuming young woman, slight of build, usually sporting neat braids and a modest sense of fashion, walked the storied corridors of the White House every day. Keisha's alarm rang at 5:30 a.m. She had taken the day off work, which she rarely did. This was no ordinary Tuesday. Her cousin, Brad Farley, was set to appear at the D.C. Superior Court on misdemeanor charges of trespassing, charges that Keisha believed were unwarranted and riddled with half-truths. Brad, a bright yet headstrong 19-year-old, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time outside a closed convenience store after hours. The store manager had called the police, insisting Brad was loitering and acting suspiciously. Brad swore he was just waiting for an Uber after a late study session at the University of the District of Columbia. The arresting officers, however, were unwavering in their stance. He looked like he was trying to break in, they claimed. Keisha found it odd that Brad's phone records clearly showed he had ordered a ride, yet the police report made no mention of it. Moreover, the convenience store security footage, which could have exonerated Brad, mysteriously wasn't recording. From her time working on community policing initiatives in her White House role, Keisha knew how quickly biases could lead to unjust outcomes. She believed in accountability, in due process, and in solutions that bridge the gap between law enforcement and communities of color. Yet here she was, about to face a system that had threatened her cousin with an undeserved criminal record. She refused to stand idly by. Dressed in a simple navy blue skirt suit, far from flashy but professional enough to be taken seriously, Keisha stepped onto the escalator at the Judiciary Square metro station. She clutched a binder full of evidence: Brad's phone logs, character references from professors, and even testimonies from security guards at his university verifying he had been there studying. She felt a swirl of nerves dance in her stomach. She wasn't a lawyer, and she didn't want to overstep the defense attorney's role, but she had meticulously prepared for days to gather everything that might help Brad. She just had to get through the hearing without revealing the giant secret that gave her unique insight into the judicial process, her job. She wasn't going to name drop the White House unless absolutely necessary, because if she did, the narrative might change. She didn't want Brad's freedom hinging on nepotism or influence. She wanted his innocence recognized for what it was. Stepping through the heavy doors of the D.C. Superior Court, Keisha tried to steady her heart. The building bustled with lawyers in crisp suits, exhausted defendants clutching paperwork, and family members anxiously waiting for their loved ones. The walls were a nondescript beige, lined with a few bulletin boards covered in legal notices. A faint smell of disinfectant lingered in the air. Across the hall, a group of uniformed officers leaned against the wall, sipping coffee from paper cups. Keisha noticed the sidelong glances they threw her way, like they were silently appraising her, measuring her worth in stereotypes. She had experienced this 1,000 times before, a tall, stoic presence scanning her with suspicion simply because of the color of her skin or the unshakable composure in her posture. Taking a seat on a lone wooden bench, Keisha was prepared to mind her own business and simply wait for Brad and his attorney. However, one officer in particular, his name tag read C. Palmer, seemed fixated on her. He nudged his colleague and muttered something inaudible. They both broke into subdued laughter. Perhaps it was a joke, perhaps not. Keisha felt her cheeks flush momentarily, but she reminded herself to stay composed. She needed to use the restroom, so she stood and glanced around for directions. As she walked past the group of officers, she heard one of them speak in a hushed but pointed tone. "You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart? This isn't the line for welfare checks." Keisha froze. She turned slowly, meeting the officer's gaze. The remark left no room for misinterpretation. It was a direct jab at her race, class, and presence in the courthouse. A flash of indignation blazed in her chest, but she steadied her voice. "Excuse me," she responded calmly, though her anger simmered beneath the surface. The officer smirked. "Just saying, you might be lost," he half laughed. His colleague, C. Palmer, feigned an apologetic shrug. "We just don't want you to get confused. Courtrooms can be complicated places for people who don't come here often." She stared at them, her jaw tensing. How easy it was for them to assume she lacked purpose or dignity. But Keisha wasn't here to get into a confrontation. She was here for Brad. "I know exactly where I'm going. Thank you," she said firmly, then continued down the hall, not looking back. Behind her, she heard the snickers continue, yet Keisha felt her resolve strengthen. She had faced worse: disrespect, thinly veiled racism, assumptions about her intelligence, and survived. She would endure this too, and though she wasn't the type to leverage her position, a small part of her took solace in the knowledge that these officers would feel quite differently if they realized who she truly was. Keisha splashed cold water on her face in the restroom, letting her anger swirl down the drain. She reminded herself that she was a professional, a representative, informally at least, of an institution that required her to embody grace under pressure. She toweled off and checked her reflection, noticing the furrow in her brow that refused to fade. When she emerged back into the corridor, she spotted Brad's defense attorney, Felicia Jones, standing with her client. Brad looked anxious, fiddling with his tie as though it were a straitjacket. Felicia, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an air of pragmatic efficiency, lifted a hand in greeting. "Keisha," Felicia said, "thank you so much for coming." Brad's face brightened a bit at the sight of his cousin. "You're actually here," he muttered, relief evident in his eyes. "I was worried you wouldn't be able to take time off." Keisha shook her head, giving him a reassuring smile. "I told you I'd be here. And Felicia, I've brought some documents you might find useful." She handed the binder over, quickly summarizing what she had compiled. Felicia's eyebrows rose in appreciation. "This is wonderful, Keisha. I'll see if I can use some of these exhibits. Hopefully we can make the judge see the truth." She lowered her voice. "But be prepared. If the officers who arrested Brad come in with a certain attitude, the hearing might get heated." Heated was an understatement, Keisha thought, recalling her recent encounter in the hallway. She glanced around. noticing that same group of officers had moved closer to the waiting area. Were they all scheduled to testify in different cases that morning? Possibly. The tension in the air was palpable, like an invisible chain connecting them. Brad tugged at Keisha's sleeve. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Just had a run-in with a couple of them," she murmured. "Nothing I can't handle." Felicia checked her watch. "We have about 10 minutes before the bailiff calls us in. Let's review the strategy once more." While Felicia laid out the steps objecting to any mention of Brad's prior warning for minor infractions, emphasizing Brad's academic record, and presenting the phone logs, Keisha found her attention drifting to the group of officers again. She couldn't help feeling that her earlier altercation was but a taste of what was to come. Suddenly a voice boomed from across the hall. "We got a problem here." It was C. Palmer, the officer whose name tag Keisha had noted. His voice carried an edge that drew the eyes of bystanders. Keisha and Felicia turned, startled. "No, officer," Felicia replied, keeping her tone professional. "Is there some issue you'd like to discuss?" Palmer's eyes narrowed. "I don't like the way you're looking over here. That's all. If you have something to say, say it." Brad started to speak, but Keisha placed a calming hand on his arm. She stepped forward, looking Palmer directly in the eyes. "We're just waiting for our hearing, officer. Nothing more, nothing less." The attention built like a coiled spring. Felicia sensed it was time to de-escalate. "We're focusing on the upcoming hearing. Sir, we mean no disrespect." Palmer let out a scoff. "Huh. I'll keep that in mind." With that, he turned on his heel, muttering something to his companions. Keisha could feel Brad trembling under her palm. "Let it go," she whispered to Brad. "We can't afford to start a scene." He nodded, though his jaw was set with anger. Felicia gestured for them to follow her to a quieter corner, where they continued their last-minute preparation. Yet even as they spoke, Keisha's mind hummed with concern. The officers seemed itching for a confrontation, and she sensed their hostility was personal. Part of her wanted to march over and say, "I know my rights, and I know exactly how this system works better than you might imagine," but she held her tongue. The best strategy was to let her cousin's lawyer do her job. The time for Keisha's revelations, if it ever came, would be on her own terms. In the hush of that waiting area, Keisha felt her mind drift back to the day she first set foot in the White House as an employee rather than a visitor. She remembered the strict security checkpoint outside the Eisenhower Executive Office building, the magnetometers, and the Secret Service agents scanning her bag with measured thoroughness. At each turn, she expected someone to step forward and say, "Actually, this must be a mistake. You don't belong here." But no one did. She flashed her new ID badge, and doors opened. That first morning, she was ushered into a modest office with a view of the White House lawn. A senior aide greeted her warmly, explaining the chain of command, the tasks she'd be handling, and the gravity of the institution she now served. Keisha had felt overwhelmed not by fear, but by an extraordinary sense of responsibility. She was part of a team that shaped policies and programs impacting millions of Americans. She also remembered how careful she had been when mentioning her job to friends and relatives, especially in her old neighborhood. She didn't want to come off as boastful or condescending. She had grown up with people who'd been beaten down by a system that often didn't care about their dreams. Now she was within the seat of the nation's power. The biggest question was, how could she use her voice to bridge that divide, to represent those who felt forgotten? Over time, Keisha garnered respect from her colleagues for her diligence, creativity, and sincerity. She took the lead on community-driven initiatives, collaborating with local nonprofits to expand educational resources for underprivileged youth. She kept her ear to the ground, never losing sight of the real-life struggles behind the sterile language of policy memos. Her direct knowledge of law enforcement issues came from hosting dialogues between police departments and grassroots organizations, forums designed to cultivate mutual understanding. While progress had been made, Keisha was not naive. She knew that biases were deeply ingrained in society and that every victory in bridging the trust gap was at best a stepping stone toward a distant finish line. Now, in a twist of fate, she found herself on the other side of the courtroom aisle. The same police officers whose leadership she might someday collaborate with were now in a position to ruin her cousin's life. If only they knew the irony. If only they knew she had sat across tables from police chiefs discussing accountability measures and community outreach programs. but they saw only a young black woman no different from the thousands that cycled through the judicial system each year. And in their eyes, that made her less than, not equal to. The door to courtroom 4B opened, and a bailiff stepped out calling for all parties in Brad Farley's case to enter. Keisha, Brad, and Felicia gathered their belongings and filed in, taking seats at the defendant's table. Directly across from them stood the prosecution's desk, where a stout assistant district attorney was already organizing notes. 2 uniformed officers, including C. Palmer, hovered nearby, presumably to testify as witnesses for the state. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, entered and took her seat on the bench. "We are on the record," she announced. "Case of District of Columbia versus Brad Farley, docket number 4293. She scanned the room, her eyes briefly settling on Keisha, who met the judge's gaze with respectful composure. "Felicia Rosegood, morning, Your Honor." Felicia Jones for the defendant. The district attorney introduced himself as well, rattling off the state's position that Brad had been found loitering with the intent to commit trespassing. The judge nodded, turning her attention to Felicia. "Ms. Jones, how does your client plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Felicia stated firmly. "All right," the judge said, flipping through her notes. "I understand we have some evidentiary motions to consider before we proceed." "Yes, Your Honor," Felicia said. "We plan to submit the defendant's phone record showing he was waiting for an Uber at the time in question. We also have character statements from his university." The district attorney stood. "We will contest the admission of these statements as irrelevant. The phone records might be permissible, but character statements do not address the incident itself." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And the officers who responded to the scene, are they present?" C. Palmer stepped forward, shoulders back. "Yes, Your Honor, Officer Palmer, Metropolitan Police Department." The judge nodded, motioning for him to take the witness stand. Once sworn in, Palmer launched into his account of the night. "We received a complaint from the store manager that someone was lurking around the closed shop. When we arrived, we saw Mr. Farley behind the building. He looked nervous, like he was trying to pry something open." Felicia scribbled notes furiously, glancing at Keisha, who clenched her jaw at the officer's creative portrayal. There was no mention of Brad's phone in Palmer's statement, no mention of him simply standing there waiting for a ride. "I approached the suspect," Palmer continued, asked him what he was doing. "He didn't have a clear answer, mumbled something about a ride, but wouldn't show me his phone at first. I believed he might be tampering with the lock of the back door." Keisha's nails dug into her palm. Brad had told her that Palmer never asked to see his phone until after he was handcuffed, and by then Brad was too shaken to say much. Felicia stood up, adopting a crisp professional tone. "Officer Palmer, did you find any lockpicking tools on Brad Farley?" "No," Palmer admitted, "but that doesn't mean he wasn't planning to." "Did you find any evidence of damage to the store's back entrance that would indicate a break-in attempt?" Palmer pursed his lips. "There was no damage visible, but we arrived before he could do anything." Keisha felt the tension in the courtroom grow. This was the narrative that Brad was a criminal in the making, caught just in time. She wanted to shout, to stand and present the evidence she had gathered, but that was Felicia's job. Her role was to remain silent until called upon. The judge looked unimpressed, but said nothing. Yet Felicia pressed on. "And the store manager's security camera. Did you or your partner check the footage that night?" Palmer cleared his throat. "The manager said the camera wasn't working. We had no reason to disbelieve him." Felicia looked pointedly at the judge. "Understood. No further questions, Your Honor." The judge sighed. "Prosecution may proceed with any further witnesses." The district attorney called the store manager next, who repeated the same story. He saw Brad by the closed store, panicked, and called the police. In cross-examination, Felicia introduced the phone logs showing Brad had indeed called an Uber minutes before his encounter with the manager. The judge admitted the records into evidence, but her expression remained neutral, revealing little of her leanings. As Keisha listened, she felt her blood boil at the subtle manipulations. She glanced back at the audience seats and saw 2 more officers from earlier, arms folded, glaring her way. She wondered if they suspected that she was more than just Brad's cousin. She wondered if they realized their sly intimidation tactics were like drops in the ocean of her resolve, insignificant once she summoned the wave of her true power. It was Felicia's turn to present Brad's side of the story. Brad took the stand, hands trembling but voice steady as he recounted. I just finished a study group at the library. I ordered an Uber. I was standing outside the store because it was brightly lit, and I felt safer than waiting on a dark corner. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. The district attorney pounced, trying to paint Brad as a Ive under questioning, but Felicia's quick objections reigned in the prosecutorial aggression. Then Felicia called a campus security guard who confirmed Brad had been at the library that evening and that he'd left around the time he claimed. Lastly, Felicia motioned to admit the character statements from Brad's professors, describing him as a diligent student, never in trouble with the law. The district attorney continued to insist it was irrelevant to the specific charge, but the judge allowed some of it for background context. Throughout all this, Keisha sat quietly resisting the urge to testify herself. However, she could sense that Felicia might call her if it came to establishing Brad's general conduct or gleaning more insight into his perspective. Yet Felicia had not signaled any intention to do so. After all, Keisha's presence as a relative might be seen as biased unless Felicia decided to use Keisha's position at the White House, which Keisha had not disclosed. Between testimonies, Keisha noticed C. Palmer and his colleagues whispering and occasionally looking her way. She felt the knot in her stomach tighten. Were they planning something? Or perhaps they recognized her from somewhere. She tried to keep a calm facade, ignoring the adrenaline thrumming in her veins. As the hearing moved forward, Felicia methodically dismantled the prosecution's shaky narrative. Still, one could never be sure how a judge might rule. The store manager's 911 call, the fact that Brad was behind the building, though he claimed it was a well-lit area, could be spun in multiple ways. Then came a twist. Felicia stood. Your Honor, at this time the defense would like to call Ms. Keisha Walker as a character witness on behalf of the defendant. A flutter of surprise spread throughout the courtroom. Keisha's eyes widened slightly, but she rose to her feet. She had expected to remain an observer, but Felicia must have decided Keisha's credibility would bolster Brad's case. Swallowing hard, Keisha approached the witness stand. She raised her right hand, swearing to tell the truth. She was keenly aware that once she stated her occupation, a ripple of realization might sweep the courtroom. The bailiff motioned her to sit. Felicia began. Miss Walker, how do you know the defendant? Keisha's voice emerged steady and confident. I'm Brad Farley's cousin. We grew up together here in Washington, D.C. Can you speak to his character? Keisha nodded. Brad is a dedicated student. He's never displayed any behavior that would suggest criminal intent. He wants to become a social worker, focusing on youth development programs. He's passionate about helping others. The district attorney stepped forward, ready to challenge. Miss Walker, you're a relative, which would obviously make you biased. Is there any reason the court should consider you a credible source beyond your familial ties? Keisha inhaled. This was the moment Felicia likely intended. She glanced at Felicia, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Keisha turned back to the district attorney. I work in public engagement for the White House, she said succinctly, though the words reverberated through the courtroom. A hush fell. The judge glanced up. Her curiosity piqued. C. Palmer from his seat in the gallery looked like he'd been punched in the gut. His eyes widened as if he finally recognized Keisha's face from some official function or from media coverage of White House staff. Murmurs rippled among the other officers. The district attorney arched an eyebrow. Public engagement for the White House. He sounded uncertain. Could you elaborate? Keisha offered a polite but unwavering smile. I coordinate outreach programs designed to strengthen relationships between governmental agencies and marginalized communities. My work involves bridging the gap between law enforcement initiatives and community organizations, among other responsibilities. The air felt charged, as though a giant gear had suddenly shifted. The district attorney tried to maintain composure. Well, Miss Walker, I appreciate your position. However, do you have direct knowledge of the events of Mr. Farley's arrest? No, Keisha conceded. I wasn't there, but I am familiar with Brad's general disposition and routine. He often studies late at his university's library. I've driven him home myself on several occasions. I can also attest to his respect for the law. Our late grandfather was a Metropolitan Police Department officer for 20 years. Brad was close to him. Felicia jumped in. So you would find it out of character for Mr. Farley to loiter behind a store with malicious intent? Absolutely, Keisha said, meeting the judge's gaze. I find that entirely out of character. The judge tapped her pen thoughtfully, looking from Keisha to Brad, and then to the prosecutor. Counsel, Any further questions for Miss Walker? The district attorney cleared his throat, obviously trying to recover from the surprise. No, Your Honor. Felicia nodded. No more questions, Your Honor. Keisha stepped down from the witness stand, ignoring the piercing stares from the group of officers. She could practically feel the heat of their anger and disbelief. Once she returned to her seat, she risked a glance in Palmer's direction. He was whispering something to the officer beside him, his jaw tight. It was clear that Keisha's revelation had unsettled them, possibly because they had disrespected her in the hallway, possibly because they now realized that messing with her might have consequences far beyond this courtroom. The judge looked at the clock, then announced they would take a short recess before moving to closing statements. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Court is in recess, she said, tapping her gavel lightly. Keisha exhaled, trying to manage the swirl of emotions inside her. Brad leaned over whispering, You work for the White House? I didn't realize how high up you were. Keisha gave him a reassuring squeeze on the arm. Let's not make a big deal about it now. Focus on staying calm. We're in good shape. Felicia gathered her papers. I'll see you both back here in a few minutes. I'll go grab a quick word with the DA about a possible settlement. She hurried off, leaving Keisha and Brad alone for the moment. As Keisha began to lead Brad out of the courtroom, she felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. She turned to CC, Palmer wearing a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. So, he said quietly, White House, huh? Brad tensed, stepping protectively closer to Keisha, but she signaled him to remain calm. Yes, she replied, tone measured. Is there something you need from me, officer? Palmer's knuckles whitened around the brim of his hat. You've got some nerve coming in here and acting all high and mighty. His voice had an edge, but it was hushed enough not to draw the bailiff's attention. Keisha held his gaze calmly. I'm only here to support my cousin. I testified honestly. His lip curled. People like you think you can bend the rules because you've got connections. Let's see if that holds when this is all over. A spark of anger flared in Keisha's eyes. If by bending the rules you mean presenting evidence and trusting due process, then yes, that's exactly what we're doing, she said, her voice sharper than before. And as for connections, maybe you should have considered how you treat people before you assumed what I was and wasn't. Palmer's nostrils flared. For a heartbeat, Keisha thought he might lash out verbally or physically, but the bailiff's reappearance seemed to keep him in check. He muttered something under his breath, then spun on his heel and stalked away. Brad looked at Keisha in awe and concern. You're playing with fire, he whispered. She let out a breath. Sometimes fire has to meet fire, she said, though her hands trembled slightly. She was well aware that Palmer's animosity could complicate things, but she also knew there was no turning back now. The cards were on the table. Out in the hallway, Brad paced anxiously while Keisha tried to maintain a calm exterior. The justice system was a place of tension and possibility where each new revelation could shift the outcome in unexpected ways, and Keisha was no stranger to pressure. She'd navigated tense policy meetings where billions of dollars and countless lives were at stake, yet nothing felt as personal as this. She looked up to see Felicia approaching, a slight frown creasing her brow. The DA isn't budging on an offer, Felicia said. He still wants Brad to take a plea, but I told him no, Brad doesn't belong in a diversion program for something he didn't do. We'll fight it out in closing arguments. Keisha nodded, her jaw set. We should do. Do we have enough to win? Felicia sighed. I believe so. The phone logs and testimonies are strong, especially with no physical evidence of attempted burglary. The only concern is the store manager's claim and the officer's word, which can carry weight, but your statement definitely helped paint Brad in a better light. Brad dropped onto a bench, running his fingers over his temples. I can't believe they try to ruin my life over something like this. Keisha sat beside him, patting his shoulder. That's why we're fighting. Moments later, the bailiff announced that the hearing would resume. Keisha, Brad, and Felicia returned to the courtroom, determined to see this through. What Keisha hadn't anticipated was Palmer being recalled to the stand at the prosecution's request, ostensibly to clarify some points in his initial testimony. Once again, Palmer took his seat, exuding a tense, simmering energy that made Keisha's stomach churn. The district attorney asked a series of innocuous follow-up questions, verifying timing and distances, then almost casually he asked, Officer Palmer, did the defendant or his associate show any signs of hostility or unusual behavior that night? Palmer paused, letting his gaze flicker toward Keisha. While the defendant was resistant at first, refusing to comply with our orders to move away from the back door, and in fact I recall him mentioning a cousin who, quote, had government connections, he acted like that was supposed to intimidate us. Keisha stiffened. Brad had never mentioned her. She was certain of it. Palmer was fabricating claims to undermine her testimony. The district attorney seized on the statement. So there was a suggestion that outside influence might be used to affect the situation? Exactly. Palmer replied, his tone dripping with insinuation. It's not the first time we've seen that tactic. Felicia shot up. Objection, Your Honor, this testimony is speculative and lacks foundation. The judge frowned, turning to Palmer. Officer, do you have any evidence to support this claim? Palmer shrugged with feigned nonchalance. Just my partner and me. We both heard him say it. I stand by my statement. Keisha's mind raced. Palmer was attempting to paint Brad as someone who threatened the police with high-level connections, tying it conveniently to Keisha's White House role. The judge's eyes narrowed. All right, I'll allow the statement, but with caution, the defense can cross-examine. Alicia, exuding restrained fury, approached the podium. Officer Palmer, when exactly did Mr. Farley allegedly mention this cousin with government connections? I believe it was right after we found him behind the store, Palmer said smoothly. Before we placed him in handcuffs. And you noted this in your official police report? Palmer hesitated. It might have been inadvertently omitted, but I remember it clearly. Alicia grabbed a copy of the police report from her folder, flipping through it. Your Honor, I see no mention whatsoever of Mr. Farley threatening to use governmental influence. That seems like a significant detail to leave out, wouldn't you agree? Palmer's face tightened. We had a busy shift. Details can sometimes be missed in the final report. Alicia pounced. So it's your testimony that you forgot to include a potentially crucial statement by the defendant that could indicate attempted intimidation or bribery. The officer crossed his arms. Yes, but that doesn't make it untrue. Keisha could sense Alicia's frustration. The seeds of doubt had been planted, but Palmer's blatant lie might still sway the judge if she believed an officer wouldn't simply fabricate testimony. At the defense table, Brad leaned toward Keisha, whispering, I never said that, I swear. I know, Keisha said quietly, patting his hand. He's lying. Alicia completed her cross-examination with a flurry of pointed questions, casting further doubt on Palmer's credibility. Still, the damage was done. The court had heard the claim, and although it was clearly unsubstantiated, it hovered in the air like a sour stench. When Palmer finally stepped down, Alicia requested permission to introduce an additional witness, Dr. Aaron Whitman, one of Brad's professors who had just arrived. The judge allowed it. Dr. Whitman testified that Brad was in his class that night, confirming the approximate time he left campus. His words supported the phone record timeline, strengthening the defense's version of events after Dr. Whitman's testimony. The judge indicated she was ready to hear closing arguments. The district attorney argued that Brad had been found in suspicious circumstances, pointing out that the store manager and police both felt threatened by his presence. Alicia countered with a logical step-by-step rebuttal. Phone records, professor testimony, lack of physical evidence, and the suspicious contradictions in the officer's account. Keisha's heart pounded as she listened. This was the culmination of all their efforts. If the judge ruled against Brad, the fallout could be huge for him. Possible probation, a criminal record, missed career opportunities. She fought the urge to stand and shout down Palmer's lies. When the judge finally spoke, the tension in the room was palpable. I've considered the evidence presented, the phone logs, the witness statements, and the testimony of Officer Palmer. She paused, scanning the courtroom. The state bears the burden of proving its case beyond a reasonable doubt. In my judgment, that burden has not been met. A wave of relief crashed over Keisha, Brad, and Alicia. The judge continued. Therefore, the charge of trespassing is dismissed. Brad sagged with relief, burying his face in his hands. Keisha exhaled in gratitude, blinking back tears they had won. However, the judge had one more note regarding the alleged attempt to intimidate law enforcement by referencing government connections. I find no credible evidence to support that claim, but I caution that if such a thing did occur, it would be highly inappropriate. This matter is closed. She tapped the gavel firmly. The clerk called for the next case, and just like that, it was over. Keisha threw her arms around Brad, and Alicia patted them both on the back. You're free, Brad, she said, completely free. They packed their belongings, heading toward the exit with a sense of elation, but Keisha's victory high was cut short when she noticed C. Palmer standing near the door, glaring at her. His face was dark with anger, as though Brad's acquittal had personally insulted him. She half expected him to make a snide remark. Instead, he simply stared his message clear. This isn't over. Outside the courtroom, Alicia bid them farewell, promising to follow up with any final paperwork. Brad couldn't stop smiling, though there was a tinge of weariness in his eyes. You saved me," he kept repeating, hugging her. Keisha laughed softly, ruffling his hair. "That's what family is for. Just promise me you won't be lingering outside random stores anymore." He rolled his eyes playfully. It was well lit, not random, but yes, I promise. Before they parted ways, Keisha's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. It was her White House office. She excused herself and stepped away to answer. It was her supervisor, Mindy Moria. "Keisha, I know you took the day off for personal reasons. Are you all right?" "Yes, everything's fine now. Court stuff from my cousin." Mindy hesitated. "I'm glad to hear you're okay. Listen, we've got a small crisis in our liaison program with the Metropolitan Police Department. Some big miscommunication about next week's community event. Think you can come in tomorrow and help smooth things over?" Keisha stifled a bitter laugh at the irony. "Of course I'll be there." Mindy thanked her and ended the call. Keisha returned to Brad, who gave her an affectionate nudge. "Trouble at the White House?" She shrugged. "Just some event planning fiasco. Butin handle it." Little did she know that handling it would put her on a collision course with C. Palmer sooner than she expected. The next morning, Keisha arrived at the Eisenhower Executive Office building, scanning her pass at the security checkpoint. She wore a fitted blazer and comfortable flat, her mind already brimming with solutions for the policing initiative Mindy had mentioned. She walked down a corridor lined with historical photographs, many capturing moments of cooperation between law enforcement and federal leaders. Keisha paused at a photo from 1963 showing civil rights leaders meeting with police chiefs. It reminded her how far the country had come and how much further it still needed to go. Mindy greeted her in the small conference room. "Morning, Keisha. Thanks for coming in on short notice. The assistant police chief is running late, but the rest of the MPD team is here," she said, motioning to the long table. As Keisha approached, her blood ran cold. Sitting near the end of the table was Officer C. Palmer, dressed in a suit rather than a uniform, presumably for this official meeting. Their eyes locked, and Keisha saw shock ripple across his face, followed by barely contained fury. Mindy glanced between them. "Keisha, do you know Officer Palmer?" Keisha swallowed hard, forcing a neutral expression. "We've met, yes." In that moment, Keisha realized Palmer hadn't fully processed who she was until now. Yesterday's revelation that she worked in the White House was one thing, but seeing her in this environment among his superiors in a position of influence was quite another. His entire demeanor radiated discomfort. The meeting commenced. Mindy introduced the topics: community outreach events, joint training sessions, bridging trust in underserved neighborhoods. Keisha led much of the discussion, referencing data and policy proposals. The other officers were receptive, but Palmer remained silent, arms folded across his chest. Eventually, Linda turned to him. "Officer Palmer, you've been assigned to some of these outreach programs." Before any input, he shifted in his seat, glancing at Keisha. "I believe we need to be cautious about who we partner with," he said, voice taut. "Sometimes these community organizers have their own agendas. We don't want to be used for someone else's political gain." Keisha took a breath. "That's why we vet each partner carefully," she replied in an even tone. "The goal is to build mutual trust, not to further any hidden agenda." Palmer stared at her. He said quietly, "As long as that trust goes both ways." Linda, sensing the tension, tried to redirect the conversation. "Right, so about the training modules." But Keisha knew Palmer's hostility was far from over. After the meeting, Linda called Keisha aside. "Are you okay?" You and Officer Palmer seemed to have some unspoken friction. Keisha forced a reassuring smile. "We have a bit of history, nothing that should interfere with the work." Linda raised an eyebrow. "All right, just be careful. We need MPD fully on board, and Palmer has the ear of a couple of top brass." Keisha nodded, appreciating Linda's concern. She was aware of the delicate balancing act required to make these initiatives successful. "I understand. I'll keep it professional." Professional, however, was the last thing on Palmer's mind. He was waiting for her outside the building when she left that afternoon, luing against a squad car that had come to pick him up. "C. Palmer." Keisha greeted more out of courtesy than warmth. He stood up straight. "So, Miss Walker, guess you think you're some big shot now telling us how to do our jobs?" She narrowed her eyes. "I'm trying to help." "Oh, I know what you're trying to do." He cut her off, stepping closer. "I warned you, people who think they can use their position to escape accountability end up learning a hard lesson." Keisha could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. "Is that a threat?" He sneered. "It's a fact. You might have gotten your cousin off, but let's see how long you can keep that up." That was enough. Keisha squared her shoulders. "Officer Palmer, If you have any professional concerns, I suggest you address them with your superiors in a respectful manner. Otherwise, this conversation is over. She turned to walk away. Hard racing. Palmer called after her, "You won't be so smug." When I'm done. Her steps faltered for a split second, but she refused to dignify his threat with a response as she hurried toward the metro station, trying to quell the shaky feeling in her limbs. What did Palmer mean by, "When I'm done"? Was he implying some sort of retaliation, or was it just empty bluster? Days passed, and Keisha immersed herself in policy briefings and follow-up discussions about the upcoming outreach event. Despite her best efforts to remain calm, she couldn't shake the anxiety that Palmer's threat had triggered. She went about her work as usual, collecting data, coordinating with nonprofit organizations, and drafting speeches for department heads, yet she was constantly looking over her shoulder, feeling as though she were being watched. Then one late evening, as she left the White House grounds, Keisha noticed a familiar patrol car parked across the street. The silhouette behind the wheels looked suspiciously like Palmer. She hurried across the street in the opposite direction, but her heart hammered. Was he following her, or was it just coincidence? She tried to reason with herself. Palmer might simply have been assigned to the area. Still, the next night, she saw the same car again, and the same ominous figure behind the wheel. She didn't report it to Linda or the Secret Service, at least not yet. She needed to be certain she wasn't imagining things. The following morning, Brad called her in a panic. "I think someone's following me," he said breathlessly. "A squad car keeps rolling by my apartment, slowing down whenever I come outside." Keisha's grip on the phone tightened. "Did you see who it was?" "No, I couldn't get a good look, but there were 2 officers in the front, and they stared me down. It happened 3 times this week." Keisha's anger flared. This was beyond a grudge. It was harassment, PL, and simple. She wasn't about to let Palmer or anyone else terrify her family. She decided it was time to take action. The next day, Keisha requested a private meeting with Linda, closing the office door behind her. "I need your help." Keisha began recounting the entire saga: Brad's arrest, the courtroom confrontation, Palmer's presence at the outreach meeting, and now the potential harassment. Linda listened intently, her expression morphing from concern to outrage. "This is unacceptable," she said firmly. "We can't have a White House staffer being intimidated by the very officers we're trying to collaborate with." Keisha exhaled, relieved that Linda took her seriously. "But I don't want to escalate it into a media scandal. That won't help Mark, and it might damage the outreach program." Linda nodded. "I'll speak with the deputy assistant. We'll arrange a meeting with the police chief. No media. We'll keep it quiet, but make it clear this can't continue." A day later, Keisha found herself in the official office of Assistant Police Chief Marion Hall. Linda had arranged the meeting discreetly, ensuring that Palmer wouldn't know in advance. As Keisha explained the situation, Hall's face hardened. "I know Palmer," she said grimly. "He's a solid officer on paper, but I've heard about his temper. I'll launch an internal review, see what's going on with these so-called patrols near your cousin's place." Keisha placed her hands on the table, voice measured. "I'm not looking for retribution, Chief Hall. I just want him to leave my cousin and me alone." Hall nodded. "I understand. If this is happening, as you say, it's crossing the line. I'll handle it quietly. In the meantime, if anything escalates, you contact me immediately." For a while, the harassment eased. Brad reported no more suspension, suspicious drive-by, and Keisha didn't spot Palmer lurking near her workplace. She even allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Maybe the internal review had put Palmer on notice, but Palmer was not the type to concede defeat. A week later, Keisha was running a quick errand downtown when she found herself cornered in a quiet side street near the government building she'd visited to pick up some documents. She was returning to the main road when she noticed Palmer following her on foot. Before she could slip away, he intercepted her, grabbing her arm with enough force to make her gasp. "You think you can go over my head?" He spat, eyes wild. Keisha shook off his grip, stepping back defensively. "Let go of me," she demanded. He pointed an accusatory finger in her face. "You told my superiors I was harassing you. You know what that does to an officer's record." Her heart pounded, but she refused to be cowed. "You were harassing me. You still are," she shot back. "If you don't back off, I'll press charges." His face twisted in rage. "Go ahead, make your big threat. You White House people think you're untouchable." "I never claimed that," Keisha said, fighting to keep her voice steady. She fished her phone out of her pocket, holding it up. "But I can record you right now if you'd like to keep going." That gave him pause. He glanced around to see if there were any witnesses. A few pedestrians had appeared at the far end of the alley, but they were too distant to hear what was happening. Palmer lowered his voice to a menacing whisper. "Your job doesn't scare me. You or your cousin crossed the line again, and I promise you'll regret it." Keisha's hand was trembling as she pointed the phone at him. "I have this on video." She lied. "Now get away from me." He glared, then stormed off, cursing under his breath. Keisha exhaled, adrenaline coursing through her veins as soon as she was sure he was gone. She called, "Linda, we have a big problem," Keisha said, trying to steady her breath. "Palmer confronted me again." Linda's voice crackled with urgency. "Get back here. We'll file an official complaint. Enough is enough." Keisha returned to the White House complex, shaken but resolute. Linda was waiting with Assistant Police Chief Hall, who had rushed over upon hearing Keisha's frantic call. Hall was furious. "That's assault. I'll have him suspended," she said, pacing in Linda's office. Linda nodded. "We should handle this immediately." "Keisha, are you willing to give a full statement?" Keisha hesitated, but after a moment she nodded yes. Within hours, the formal complaint was filed. The next day, Palmer was suspended pending an investigation. His rage boiled over, and in a desperate act of retaliation, he leaked a distorted version of events to a local news outlet, claiming that a high-level White House staffer was abusing her power to discredit a police officer. The story caught fire. Journalists sniffed out Keisha's identity, though her name wasn't initially included in official statements. Suddenly, Keisha was caught in a media storm. She read headlines that twisted the narrative. Police officer claims White House interference in local trespassing case. Brave officer harassed by police. Political elite. Keisha felt sick reading the spin. People on social media chattered about it, some praising Palmer for standing up to corruption, others lambasting him for targeting a black woman who just happens to work in the White House. By the end of the week, major outlets were covering the story, seeking statements from the police department and the White House press office. Keisha found herself in a maelstrom she never wanted. She retreated to her small apartment each night, turning off her phone to avoid the barrage of calls. Her mother called, worried. Brad sent supportive messages reminding her they were in this together. But everything changed when a piece of security footage surfaced. Footage from a surveillance camera across the street from the alley. It showed Palmer grabbing Keisha and her pushing him away, capturing his animated threats, if not the exact words. Another angle from a local business's camera confirmed Palmer's aggressive approach. With this evidence public, the tables turned instantly. News outlets ran the footage on a loop, this time accompanied by a narrative of how Palmer had lied about being the victim. The police department scrambled to defend their processes, and the White House press secretary, without naming Keisha, condemned the officer's behavior as deeply troubling. By the time the police department's internal affairs completed its review, Palmer's career was in free fall. The footage, combined with Keisha's testimony and the earlier complaints, painted a stark picture of misconduct and abuse of power. Additional citizens came forward alleging similar harassment and intimidation tactics. Assistant Chief Hall made a public statement: "No officer is above the standards of professional conduct." Effective immediately, Officer Palmer has been terminated from the Metropolitan Police Department. Keisha watched the press conference from the break room at the White House, a swirl of emotions churning inside her: relief, vindication, sadness that it had come to this, and anger that Palmer had taken it so far. Her colleagues offered words of encouragement. Brad texted her celebratory emojis. Linda gave her a reassuring pat on the back. Later that day, Keisha received a personal visit from Chief Hall, who apologized on behalf of the department and assured her that they were rolling out new training programs to address the sort of bias and aggression Palmer had displayed. Keisha thanked her, expressing hope that true reforms could emerge from this ordeal. For Palmer, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. A potential civil lawsuit loomed over him from Keisha's legal team, though Keisha herself wasn't seeking damages. She was determined to ensure accountability so that no other young black man or woman would be subjected to Palmer's intimidation. Media headlines shifted to portray him as a cautionary tale, an officer who weaponized his badge to settle personal scores, only to be undone by his own arrogance. A month later, Keisha stood at a podium in a White House briefing room for a youth-focused press event. Her presence was purposeful, a statement that she would not be silenced or marginalized. She began by acknowledging the challenges many marginalized communities face, the importance of trust between police and citizens, and the power of accountability. She didn't mention Palmer by name. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew the context of her story. She spoke eloquently about how real change requires vigilance from both sides, law enforcement and the community. She emphasized that most officers serve honorably, but abuses of power must be confronted no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Afterwards, she stepped away from the podium, heart-pounding. Brad was in the front row, tears in his eyes, clapping. Her mother was also there, beaming with pride. Linda and other colleagues gave her a standing ovation, Keisha realized that while the struggle for justice and equality was far from over, she had done her part to bend the arc a little closer toward what was right. In the hallway afterwards, reporters buzzed around, eager for more quotes. Keisha graciously turned them down, preferring to let her official statement stand. She found a quiet moment and slipped outside into the cool evening air. She gazed up at the White House silhouetted against the night sky, remembering her father's words from years ago. One day, you'll do something important here. A gentle breeze carried the faint hum of traffic from Pennsylvania Avenue. Keisha closed her eyes and took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of gratitude. She had faced disrespect and danger, yet she had stood her ground. Brad's future was safe, and Palmer had been held accountable. Her father had been right. She was indeed doing something important in this city, helping to ensure justice one step at a time. From a courthouse hallway filled with quiet contempt to the corridors of power inside the White House, Keisha Walker's journey reminds us that courage thrives when convictions run deep. She refused to bow to intimidation, fighting for justice for her cousin while breaking down the walls of silent prejudice. And when Officer Palmer's threats escalated, she stood firm, letting the truth finally come to light. In the end, her resolve to hold individuals accountable, no matter their authority, reminds us that systemic change starts with each person who dares to speak up. Hard karma came for those who abused their power, but for Keisha the reward was far greater: vindication and a platform to advocate for those without a voice. If you've been inspired by Keisha's story, please hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that uplift and empower. Your support helps us spread stories that matter.